House Bill 1007, Amendment 2. Mr. Speaker, I move that House Bill 1007.
Heard the motion and the second. Representative Pierce is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, this amendment will restore the intent of this General Assembly when it comes to how we calculate the excess energy from people's individual rooftop solar systems that then determines how much they actually get compensated for that. So for those of you who've been around here a while, you remember in 2017 we had a fairly controversial bill, lots of discussion, that overhauled what we called the net metering law. So up until that time, if you put in a rooftop solar system, for every kilowatt hour of extra energy you didn't need that you fed back into the grid, you would get a credit on your bill equal to that kilowatt hour that you could use later. So it was kind of a one-for-one. Well, the debate that occurred during that bill was some people argued that that retail credit was too high, too rich, and it should be closer to something that utilities pay for wholesale on the open market. And so there was tremendous debate about what is the right rate. All right, it settled out at the wholesale price plus a 25% premium. During that whole time debating, never once can I recall a single proposal or even conversation about changing the way in which you figure out how much excess energy are we talking about in the first place. In fact, the introduced version of the bill in the Senate had some language that suggested some changes in how that calculation is made, and when it was brought to the attention of the author, it was immediately removed. It wasn't intended. So to me, having lived through that debate and followed that bill as it tracked through, it's clear to me that this General Assembly never meant to change the way the calculation was made. It did intend to change the amount that people were paid for their excess energy. So what happened was when the utilities came in, so by the way, I should note that by reducing it from this kind of one-to-one retail rate credit down to wholesale plus 25%, that significantly lowered the payments, the value of the excess energy that the solar system owners would get. So these individual homeowners with rooftop solar already were going to get less money over time as the bill is implemented. What that means is if you're thinking about putting solar in, you have to calculate what's the payback period. And maybe under the old system, it's like 10 years, and then after that, you benefit from your investment, because panels last about 30 years. Well, when the utilities came in to the IURC to file their new tariffs under this new bill, they weren't content just to benefit from the lower, significantly lower amount they were going to be able to pay based on the legislation passed by this General Assembly. But they went further and they said, we want to change the way we calculate this to something called instantaneous netting. And I could get into all the complications of explaining how that's different than the other version, but the bottom line is it significantly cuts even more the value of the excess energy that the rooftop solar owner is feeding back into the grid. So now the payback period on those solar panels extends out to like 25 years. So it's doing two things. It's making it less affordable for people to install the solar. And then what it really did, which we don't talk about much, is it is decimating economic development in the area of solar. We have all kinds of small business entrepreneurs out there who've gone into this business of installing rooftop solar. And they were just beginning to get some momentum, coming into maturity as businesses. And this double whammy of us lowering the rate per kilowatt hour that has to be paid, and then the utility commission making policy by letting them change the way they calculate it so there's even less to pay for, they're basically destroying these small business entrepreneurs. And they're reducing the ability of us to get the benefit of rooftop solar that I talked about on the last amendment, so I won't go into that again. So what this amendment would essentially say is IURC, you've got to revert back to the original system that we intended, which is where at the end of the month, you look back and you see, okay, how much electricity did they use? Did they feed in more electricity back to the grid than they used? If they did, there's an excess there, and then we're going to pay them the wholesale rate times 25%. And it would prohibit this instantaneous inflow-outflow type of netting that was never discussed or debated or specifically put in the statute that we passed. I'd urge you to support the amendment.
For discussion on the amendment, Representative Saleh, speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, it's a difficult issue. We wrestled with it a great deal. 2017 was painful, Representative Pierce, for all of us. But at that time, we decided to do net metering. That term applies to full retail when you sell the electricity back. So you're not paying for the wires or all of the system that's there to back up if your solar panels don't work. California started it in 2017. We said, you know what? We need to help kickstart the solar industry. And we agreed to net metering at the time. The senator who carried that bill was wise enough to retire, so he didn't have to stand up here. But we said, we'll give it a try for 5 years. California has backed off of net metering, and they have far more rooftop solar. We have about 6,800 homes with rooftop solar right now. So we have looked at it and looked at it. There was a lot of, would you extend it for some period of time? In the meantime, when the date of expiration came, as Representative Pierce said, one utility said, the way we read the statute, we can do instantaneous metering, because here's what was happening, and California is a better example because it's a much bigger market, far more solar out there. But on a warm day with a bright sun, they would, the folks who had rooftop solar would sell all their electricity at full retail when there was, the demand wasn't there. And they would bank it. And then they could collect it, in their case, at the end of the year, in our case, at the end of the year, or whenever they wanted to collect it. So when we all took a look at it, we said, you know, we'll continue some subsidy. We'll do it at 25% over wholesale. So they're still getting some subsidy. But metering and banking is not fair to the other consumers, because that's who's paying. It's the other consumers. So we looked at it, Senator Cook and I looked at it, and we said, we're not going to renew it. We're going to, and then the Supreme Court acted. And they said, under the statute as it stands, instantaneous is the appropriate decision, which is the decision the IURC made. So it's a maturing industry. We subsidized it to get it started, and we now have across the country some adjustment now for a maturing industry. I would urge you to vote against the amendment. Let's let it mature. Let's let it survive on its own.
Further discussion on the amendment? Chair sees none. Would the author like to close? Representative Pierce. Roll call has been requested and seconded. Will be granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. Well, as much as I'd like to go back and redebate the wholesale plus 25% rate, this amendment is simply about how that's calculated. Because the debate we had during that bill was all about what is the proper amount of compensation for people feeding excess energy in. And you had people saying retail is too high, which, by the way, I'd like to remind you that when a kilowatt hour comes into the grid from a rooftop solar and they get paid wholesale plus 25%, the utility, when that kilowatt hour goes into the home next door, they get charged the full retail rate. So the General Assembly got to a rate that they thought was fair to all of the ratepayers out there. And there was great controversy and debate about whether that's the right number, but that's the number the General Assembly came up with. When the Utility Commission let them then rig up the way they calculate the excess so the excess is way lower, they essentially took that compensation down below what we intended. They undermined the solar industry even further. And I'm telling you, just for those of you here, just think back. Do you ever once remember somebody having an amendment, talking about, discussing anything about changing the way you calculate what the excess is? It never happened. And with all due respect to the Supreme Court, they weren't here listening to it. They got it wrong when they said that was okay. And you know, the great thing about it, they interpreted a statute. You can't expect them to understand everything we do here at a level necessary to know what we were thinking. But we have the ability with this amendment to correct that ruling, to make clear what our intent was, to be the policymakers. I don't know how many times I've heard at this microphone that we, the General Assembly, should be the policymakers, particularly when it comes to things related to utilities. And we should not let the IURC just go off on its own and make up policies. It should work at our direction. In this case, the IURC went off and made its own policy, with nothing in our legislation indicating that we wanted them to do that. So this is our opportunity to correct it, to help a new emerging sector of our economy, and to also give people an opportunity for energy independence and for individual initiative. Right? We get to decide. You vote for this amendment, you can support people who through their own individual initiative are trying to become more energy independent, or you can vote against the amendment and stand behind the utilities who are manipulating the system to maximize the return to their shareholders. I don't blame them for that. That's their job. They're a corporation. Their job is to return value to shareholders, meet the next quarterly report. But we as policymakers need to balance out the interests of the shareholders against interests of ratepayers and other people in our state. And we shouldn't be tilting it completely toward the utilities. And for that reason, I urge you to support this amendment.
The question is on the adoption of the amendment. Roll call has been requested and granted. When the machine is open, all those in favor will vote aye. All those opposed vote no. Have all the members voted? Tally the roll. Roll call shows 30 ayes, 61 noes. Amendment has been defeated.